A man born into slavery ended up governing France's richest colony. July 1801. A constitution is published for the French colony of Saint-Domingo, the island territory that is Haiti today. It declares that no slave can exist on the territory and that servitude is forever abolished. It opens every kind of employment to every color, and it names one man governor for the rest of his life, with the power to pick his own successor. His name was Toussaint Louverture. He was born into slavery on the Breda plantation. The book we're walking through today is C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, first published in 1938 and revised by him in 1963. That's not only a fact about 1801, it changes the story we inherit about the age of revolutions, or at least it changed mine. That sequence from one famous republic to the next, which, in the popular telling, reaches the 19th century with him nowhere in it. And the shape of what's missing is specific. He is not a man nobody recorded. He is a man I had filed under uprising instead of statecraft. So how did he come to govern, and what does the state he built cost the version of him we'd rather carry? The arrival is wrong in every way a legend needs it to be right. The revolt breaks out on the northern plain in August of 1791, and he isn't in it. For a full month he stays where he is, on the Breda plantation, keeping the estate in order. He sends Madame de Libertas toward the port of Le Cap in his brother Paul's care. He moves his own wife and children somewhere safe. Then he walks to the camp of the people who'd risen. James wrote, quote, 1 month after the revolt had begun, that Toussaint Breda joined them and made an unobtrusive entrance into history, end quote. Unobtrusive means quiet enough that nobody turns around. It is a strange word to spin on the man in this book's subtitle, and I read the choice as deliberate. The entrance is late, and it is small. Now I have to stop and correct him, because the correction changes who is walking into that camp. James tells you this man was a slave until he was 45. It isn't true. And James had no way of knowing it wasn't. Documents surfaced long after 1938, a marriage certificate, and a baptismal record dated between 1776 and 1777, and a letter Toussaint wrote in 1797 saying he had been free for more than 20 years. He had been manumitted in the 1770s, which is to say, his owner had formally released him, on paper, decades before the revolt. So by August of 1791, he had been a free man for well over a decade. He leased a small coffee plantation, and the people working it were enslaved people he held himself, which cuts both ways, and the episode needs both edges. The man who waited out that month was not a slave. What he was doing in it, we don't know, and I'd be inventing if I told you. What we do know is what he did after. The freedom he later writes into law isn't autobiography. It's a decision made by someone who had lived on the other side of that ledger and chose against his own former position. He didn't rise because he was destined. When he walked into that camp, he walked in as a property owner. He rose out of things he already had, and they had been sitting on that plantation before the first shot. He'd been steward of the livestock on the estate. A steward ran things day to day, and the book is precise about what the post did to him. It gave him experience in administration, in authority, and in dealing with the people who ran the plantation. He was running a piece of the operation and dealing directly with the men who ran the rest of it. He could also read, which the book treats as exceptional for a man in his position. What he read matters more than that he could. Caesar's commentaries, the Roman general's own account of his campaigns, which the book says gave him a sense of politics and of the military art, and of how those two things connect. And Raynal's long volume on the East and West Indies, read and reread, which gave him a grounding in how the European colonial powers actually worked, their trade, and their politics. Put those together. A man stewarding livestock on a Caribbean estate understood the empires whose armies would soon be fighting in his colony. This is not a story about how reading lifts anyone out. It's that a stewardship and two books were sitting on that estate, in a life nobody was watching for signs. The book has him commanding an army of some 5,000 men and says that Toussaint and the blacks had become the decisive factors in the revolution. His chief officers were, like him, ex-slaves. Dessalines, Christophe, who walked away from a hotel to go and find the rebel band up in the hills. His own brother Paul, and Moise, whom he had adopted and who passed as his nephew. Early on, he fought for Spain, which held the other half of the island, and then he turned against them. The Spanish had fooled him for a while, he wrote afterwards, and it had not taken him long to see it. He had abandoned them and beaten them well. Switching sides in the middle of a war and then beating the side you left is not only soldiering. It can be read as judgment about which empire is worth being useful to, and for how long, which is the connection between politics and war doing visible work. Then Britain sent an army of its own, and that campaign is where James makes a very large claim in his own voice. He calls it the severest such defeat any British force sent overseas had taken in the 3 centuries running from Elizabeth's reign up to the Great War. Writing in 1938, he means the First World War. That's James's judgment, not a source's. And his own preface says he is confident the narrative will prove his judgment of this man. So take it as a 1938 verdict from a man arguing a case. He then does 2 things that help. He qualifies it himself. He says the climate helped, and he credits the black laborers who had so recently been slaves, along with the men of mixed descent who stayed loyal, fighting under officers drawn from their own ranks. Then he steps out of the way. That campaign, he says, went unreckoned for more than 100 years, until a British Army historian called Fortescue turned the record up in 1906. And Fortescue laid the blame on his own government's ministers, Pitt and Dundas. Fortescue's account is that those ministers kept shipping soldiers into the Caribbean, meaning to break French power there. James quotes Fortescue, who wrote, quote, only to discover, when it was too late, that they had practically destroyed the British Army, end quote. Hear who is speaking there. Britain's own military historian, Britain's own ministers, Britain's own army, wrecked in the Caribbean. What did he build with that? A state and a document to hold it. And the document is where I nearly got the story backwards. Toussaint did not free the enslaved of Saint-Domingo. That had already happened. French officials abolished slavery in the colony in 1793, and in February 1794, the Revolutionary Parliament in Paris abolished it across the whole empire. That is where part 1 of this series ended. What changed by 1801 is that the abolition was no longer safe. Napoleon's Constitution of 1799 had provided that the colonies would be governed by special laws of their own, separate from French law, which meant the colonies could be handed a different rule than France had by whoever held Paris. That is the kind of clause you write when you are leaving a door open. And on the 4th of February, 1801, the 7th anniversary of that abolition to the day, Toussaint called an assembly to write Saint-Domingo a constitution. The record gives us the date, not the motive. I read it as a man slamming a door, and you can weigh that reading for yourself. Here's the book's verdict on whose document it really was. James wrote, quote, the Constitution is Toussaint Louverture, from the first line to the last, and in it he enshrined his principles of government, end quote. Read as tribute, that's a compliment about force of personality. Look instead at what the document does. Servitude forever abolished, and every employment open to every man whatever his color. And also, administration, finance, police, and the army confided to him. Censorship of everything printed. An assembly that could accept or reject laws, but elected by administrators he appointed. And the governorship for life, with the power to name whoever came next. Decisive power gathered into one office. And the room it came out of is worth naming. In James's account, the assembly was 6 men, wealthy whites and men of mixed descent, and he says there was not one black among them. The primary text of the Constitution lists a larger body, so the count is his, not settled fact. What James does not dispute is who was in the room. The document that locked emancipation into law was produced through an assembly of the colony's propertied men. What did he require of the people whose emancipation that Constitution declared? Here's the comfortable reading. The liberator without a shadow. A man history simply left out of the sequence. The book won't let it stand. He confined the formerly enslaved to the estates under rigid penalties, with his district generals answerable for making sure the work got done. If that's slavery with the name changed, everything we've built collapses, as it should. But notice where the charge comes from. Not from a critic of the book, from the book. James wrote, quote, "The only disciplined force was the army, and Toussaint instituted a military dictatorship," end quote. He names it himself in the hardest words available. Then he measures what that dictatorship changed. James wrote, quote, "Where formerly the laborers had worked from dawn until far into the night, now work began at 5 and ended at 5. No employer dared to beat them," end quote. Dared. That word had teeth behind it. When Dessalines took the whip to laborers in the province he governed, the answer from Toussaint was a threat to strip his command at the least complaint. At the least complaint. Laborers were fed and housed and kept a quarter of what the estate produced. And James delivers his own verdict on the whole arrangement. Enough, he says, to mark the change from the old despotism to the new one. Is it slavery renamed? I don't think the label settles cleanly, and I distrust anyone who tells you it does. A share of the crop, a day with an end, and an employer who no longer dared raise a hand are real material differences, and they are not nothing. It is also confinement to the plantations under rigid penalties, with generals answerable for the work imposed on people whose emancipation that same Constitution declared. Both true. James settles it as far as he is willing to go, and where he stops is the whole problem. Not a change from despotism to freedom, but from one despotism to another. Come back to the question I opened with. He came to govern because a revolution he did not start opened a position that his particular formation was well fitted to fill. And he then governed through powers gathered into his own office, which the Constitution wrote down and tried to make permanent. Now the contradiction that answer opens. It's the hinge of the whole book, and the author puts it in the opening pages, before the narrative has earned it. James wrote, quote, "Yet Toussaint did not make the revolution. It was the revolution that made Toussaint. And even that is not the whole truth," end quote. He refuses the great man's story, and he refuses the story where people are only products of their circumstances, and he lands on this. People of the first rank do shape history, but only inside what their circumstances make possible. Then he presses the other end of it. Without the revolution, he says, this extraordinary man and the gifted people around him would have lived out their lives as slaves in the service of the people who owned them. That's James's counterfactual, close to his words. And by now, we know it isn't literally true of Toussaint, who had been released from slavery in the 1770s. It is true on James's own account of who they were, of the men who became his officers, Dessalines, Christophe, Moise, ex-slaves who, without a revolution, would have lived out their lives as somebody's property. So the achievement and the despotism aren't two findings about him. They're one. Work that begins at 5 and ends at 5. On a plantation you are not permitted to leave. That's the settlement he built, and both halves of it are his. Whether the concentration of power was what held the colony or what he simply could not put down afterward, I don't think these chapters settle, and I'm not going to pretend they do. So here's where it lands, and where you may part company with me. If the author is right, that circumstance made the man, and the man then made what circumstance allowed, then measuring him against a peaceful republic is asking the wrong question of him. But if confining freed people to plantations under rigid penalties is disqualifying whatever the circumstances, the argument breaks.
And I think the break is there, in the plantations.